Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast. The fifth web developer caved, and now we are the #1 podcast in the entire world. I am one of your hosts this week, Justin Ribeiro, and with me, as always, Mr. Danny Blue. Danny, how's it going out there?
It's going pretty good. It's raining. It's been raining for 2 weeks. I'm very sad. My psyche can't take much more of it. But other than
I
that,
lived in Seattle for a long time, and that was just, it rained all the time, and you just learn to deal.
I don't like it at all. I will say that I can appreciate that Prince died 2 weeks ago, and it's been raining ever since. So we've got that. So we've got that as well.
Cue the Prince music at this point. We don't have licensing for that. The producers tell me we don't have a license. So, Danny, what are we talking about this week?
So this week we are going to be talking about Cypress IO. We have one. I don't even know if we want to call her a guest panelist or just a new regular. Last week we had her on talking about System.js, but we have Mel Hussein back with us.
Hey, hello.
Awesome. So, and this was actually based off of her recommendation, but so we're going to be talking about Cypress IO, and we have a couple people who we are assuming know more about Cypress IO than we do. So first off, we have Brian Mann, who is the creator and founder of Cypress IO. So say hi, Brian.
Hello, everyone.
And we have Gleb with a last name that I can't pronounce, and I didn't want to insult him by destroying it. But Gleb, go on and say hello.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So really, what has become pretty much for any developer podcast, talking about stuff we don't know, talking about things we're assuming people don't know, we have to ask the first question of what is Cypress IO and what problems is it trying to solve? Brian, if you wanted to go ahead and tackle that.
Sure, I'll take it away. Great first question. Well, I'll say that Cypress IO is both a tool and a next-generation service, and it's built around trying to solve the hardest problems that we deal with as web developers, building applications that are ultimately delivered to the browser. We believe that the existing tools that are mostly built around Selenium really just don't work for the way that we approach development these days, and this is a tool that is just fundamentally different. It's architecturally very different than what Selenium provides, and it's been built from the ground up to work for developers and allow them to much easier test their web applications.
Sorry, I was on mute. Perfect. So my first question along those lines is this a deployed or installed solution to something like Selenium, or is it a more of a cloud service or tool?
It's really a hybrid of both, and I'll just say that solving testing is a very, very difficult problem to solve, and I believe it requires sort of a multifaceted approach. And really, Cypress, the core of what users are using right now, is just a desktop application. So it's something that you're going to install on your local machine, that it's going to be running there in the background, and really that's sort of the replacement to a Selenium server per se. Like, it basically does all the magic in the background. You'll go in there, you'll launch projects, but then you'll work entirely in the browser, which is obviously, as a web developer, what you're comfortable doing. So we have this really great experience where it's really simple to get projects up and running, to write your first test, and to develop and test at the same time inside of Cypress. But then when you go to sort of manage your tests, as you write an ever-growing number of them, you'll want to run them in continuous integration. And that's actually where our service cuts in, and we are actually spawning browsers in the cloud. We're doing things like recording video, taking screenshots, giving you access over VNC to basically spawn instances on demand, and then record all those results and then feed them back into the desktop app. So it's sort of like one complete circle that is really hybrid. It's both a local and a remote experience.
Perfect. That I think that answered any question I would ever have about that specific thing. But no, that sounds really cool. So you've mentioned we've said the word testing a couple of times already, and I just wanted to point out that when we are talking about testing, in this case, we are talking more about end-to-end testing versus unit testing. Is that correct, or is it both?
I mean, right now, I would say it's end-to-end testing and integration testing. I think
Okay.
we'll get more into this. Unit testing is also something that we're trying to solve. That requires something that's a little bit different than what we're offering right now. And it will only ever solve unit testing when it comes to code that is delivered to the browser. For instance, when you're writing your backend services in Node or another language, we're never going to touch that area of unit testing. But for React code or Angular directives or things like that, that traditionally you would potentially write a unit test around. If it's being delivered to the browser, we're going to be able to do that as well.
Okay. And Brian or Gleb, either one of you feel free to answer that. But so since we are talking about focusing on this like end-to-end and integration testing, can we just go over really quickly for anybody that doesn't know what those are, what end-to-end testing is, what integration testing is, and how it is different from unit testing that maybe more people are familiar with?
Brian, do you want to answer that, or I can answer that?
Oh, go ahead, Gleb. I think you can take it away.
Excellent. So unit testing is literally testing a particular piece of code in complete isolation. So think you wrote a function in JavaScript, and then you just give it a bunch of inputs, and you make sure that the output is what you expect them to be. The code runs in isolation. It should run very, very quickly. Usually, you don't interact with DOM or databases. You mark or stop them. You literally want to, really quickly run all your unit tests. And this is great, right? Like if you're a developer, you just sit there at your local laptop, and as you change the code, it just reruns the test right away, and you know right away the code is broken. On the other hand, once you build a library, it usually has to work with data, has to work with the browser. Now you're talking about end-to-end testing, right? Is your website working, right? Is your website talking to a database? If you enter, user ID, does it actually find your user? So now you're talking about a deployed website, and you want to test that. And you want to test it almost as the user was using it. So another name for that is also functional testing. Does your website function as you would expect it? And this is a much harder problem because you cannot do it quickly. You have to have usually everything deployed. You cannot stop. You have to go through the user interface layer. You can't work directly with data. And that's much harder problem. I've written myself unit testing frameworks. I've used pretty much every JavaScript unit testing framework. And there are a bunch of great ones like Mocha. But end-to-end so far has eluded even people who have been thinking about it a lot. Hope it answers the question.
Yeah, and so Gleb, I think can you maybe walk us through? So Cypress is a fairly new framework, and you're an early adopter, and so can you maybe talk a little bit about how you've been using it, and I think why you chose to use it, and what problem it's solving for you?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm not part of the Cypress team. I don't know Brian personally. I only know him through Twitter and internet. I've seen, I think, Cypress kind of demo video, kind of teaser a long time ago, and I thought to myself, well, this is very interesting. Because in my own development life, I'm working at Kensho, which is a financial startup, and we do a lot of testing, and I've been doing testing with pretty much any framework or any tool you can imagine. So we started with Phantom for end-to-end testing, which is a headless browser. And it was very clunky and had lots of bugs. The kind of interface was not great. There is a wraparound Phantom called Casper, so we switched to Casper, also headless, also very clunky, hard to work with. Then we switched to Selenium cluster, so we're actually running real browsers, and we're controlling them through Java. And it's cross-browser solution, but it's, again, clunky, very flaky. You have to maintain it. Someone has to make sure everything is working. So right now we're working with Selenium cluster through Protractor, which is a library from Google for end-to-end testing. which is geared towards Angular apps, yet it still, you can test any app really with that. And yet I was never happy. And so when Cypress actually started open beta program by invitation a couple months ago, I got an invite because I signed up a long time ago, and I looked at a video that Brian has done, and I was just, this is exactly what I want. Like this kind of abstraction around working UI, very natural API is exactly what I want. So I started testing my own open source projects. And I tested server-side rendering code, like simple to do MVC, and I just loved the experience. I was up and running in literally 5 minutes, and anytime I had a question, I literally either looked at the docs or at the example, and I knew how to do it in a minute. Then I decided, well, there is no way Cypress is good for testing a JavaScript library, because I had a little pop-up library that was JavaScript, but had to interact with DOM, because there was no server. But again, Cypress just surprised me by just loading plain file, finding all the right JavaScript, and being able to work. Recently, I tested a small Cycle.js web app, and again, it just blew my mind, how natural to a developer the API was, how intuitive it was. And I'll give you an example, and Brian, props to you. So in my web app, I had to enter a couple of values and then take the focus away from a text field, and then the web app would actually know that I want to compute. I'm done with entering stuff. And so I use like Cypress, find field, enter something, and then like, well, it hasn't done anything because it hasn't triggered blur event. Okay, how do I trigger blur event? And I was like, well, I bet Cypress you just do .blur method call, and it just worked. Right? So it was like the API was so natural, I could guess how to do things. And then I read the documentation, and like I'm really happy Cypress user. And just to so I could remember myself and trying to promote it at Kensho, I wrote a blog post about Cypress, and it got quite a few views. And I think more people now know about Cypress and what a great tool it is. So that's my story with Cypress.
That's great. Yes, thanks so much, Gleb, for writing that. That's what we're going for. Just really happy users that want to go out and share it. So Amal, I have to confess, my internet flaked for about 30 seconds. So it picked up right when Gleb was just in the middle of talking. So I kind of missed the question, but I think I got the gist of it.
Yeah, that's not a problem. I was really just asking him about what pain points it solved for him, and and why his experience so far. And so I guess for me, as someone who writes day to day in JavaScript, there's a lot of fatigue around new, right? And so one more JavaScript framework I have to learn, I'm going to have to quit my job. So I guess how hard is it, to kind of start using this? And I'm also really interested to know what the developer experience is like, because obviously this is a framework written by developers for developers, right? So, and I know that you were trying to solve many of your own problems when writing this. And so, what's the upstart and the ramp up time to get started with this?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I will just say that really from the get-go, Cypress has been built around sort of adopting the most used, the most loved existing JavaScript tools and sort of building, standing on their shoulders. I mean, I am a JavaScript developer. I've been in the space now for 8 years. Even prior to doing Cypress, I did a different project called Backbone Rails, where I basically got a chance to do screencasts about teaching developers all over the world about using Backbone and Rails when those were sort of the two hottest things. And I really got a chance to interact with much more than just my field of vision for the developers that I worked with on projects at work. And I got a chance to talk to hundreds of different developers all over the world. And I think we all identify with the problems of testing. And I mean, I'll just say that all of the APIs of Cypress is sort of built to extend your existing knowledge. Like, and it could be as simple as To Gleb's point about how natural the API felt, I mean, we've sort of, taken a lot of methods from jQuery. Most developers these days, if you're a web developer, you pretty much know the jQuery DOM traversal methods by heart. And, we sort of just baked all of those in there to where there's no surprises. One of the biggest pain points of developers is just getting started. And yes, like JavaScript fatigue is just something that I think we just naturally have to combat, because it's just going to continue. There's just going to be more innovation into this space. And I think that, when you're building a product, you have to take that into account. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is basically reduce the mental effort that it takes to basically learn about Cypress, for it to sort of peel and reveal slowly sort of the intricate details of really what's happening. So, when you're using Cypress, like to Gleb's point, you can basically get up and running in less than 5 minutes. Like, we automatically seed your project with an example spec that really demonstrates all of the usages of Cypress's API, to where without writing a single line of code, you can at least see it working. You can get through those first hurdles and slowly experience the API. I mean, it's such a central goal of ours to just have to really work for developers, to really make them happy and productive. And so, we've written literally, not exaggerating, hundreds of custom errors for basically every typical situation that you might think would work or that you go down. There's probably an error that catches you and even dissects how you've written something and tells you the exact way to rewrite it. We just want to create that type of experience. And yeah, so far it seems like we've done a good job.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that all sounds really, really good. Go ahead, Gleb.
Can I add something? Just to get back to how easy it is to bootstrap a project. So from my experience, you start Cypress binary, which is like a little proxy server that you install once on your laptop. And then you just open the folder with your project that you want to test. And if a project doesn't have Cypress tests, then Cypress will create initial setup for you. That's it. So as soon as it sees a new folder that it doesn't recognize, it will bootstrap you. It will add the example test so you know how to use it. And you can start running right away. So it's literally not even 5 minutes. With a good internet connection to download the binary, probably 1 minute.
That's pretty great. And Gleb, I can't really tell. Are you a fan of Cypress or not? I can't really tell.
So I'm a huge fan. I'm not affiliated. I don't get any benefits or financial rewards for saying that. I'm just fed up with the current state of testing.
Yeah.
I've written testing tools myself that became popular, especially for Angular, and I know what a pain point it is. I recently worked on our Selenium tests, and I spent days trying to optimize API, make it more promise returning, make it more natural. And so when I saw Cypress, like, this is exactly what we're trying to achieve, and you solve so many problems that we're trying to do ourselves.
Yeah. So you've both mentioned that that something like this is it's difficult to do. This isn't an easy problem to solve. But why is this end-to-end testing so difficult? Like, why does something like Cypress need to exist?
Yeah. So I guess I'll go ahead and take this one. So this is a great question, and it has a very technical and long answer. So when you are doing true end-to-end testing, you basically are testing on top of the world as it is. You really cannot reach in. You can't control things, and certainly when it comes to browser testing with the way that Selenium actually works and automates the browser, it's basically like you're outside of the fence and you're throwing commands over, but you don't really know what happened to them. I mean, after you throw them, then you have to subsequently sort of ask, well, what is the state of things? Where are you at now? And because of that, there's just this enormous amount of unpredictability. When it comes to modern JavaScript applications where, I mean, if you really just think about the DOM, it's a giant mutable object with rich interactions and complex things going on. It just means that you'll never really truly definitively know. And because of that, that just creates an inherent amount of flake and brittleness to where even if your test passed once, if you run it again, given a different set of conditions, it's going to fail. And I will almost just say that it's sort of like, in order to solve end-to-end testing or to make it easier or better, you basically don't do end-to-end testing. And I know that that kind of like sounds like a cop-out. It's kind of like, wait, what? I thought you write end-to-end tests with Cypress. And you can still basically seed the database. You can sort of set up the world as it is and then do things that simulate user behavior and then poke at the DOM basically and figure out whether something happened. But what is so fundamentally different about Cypress is that it lives inside of the browser. It is the exact inverse of the way that Selenium works, where Selenium is on the outside and it's throwing remote commands over the fence and poking at it. Cypress is the opposite. It's actually inside of the browser. It is the thing that is controlling your applications, and you control it from the inside. And because of that, it runs in the same run loop as the browser, and therefore when anything happens, it is synchronously notified, and therefore it is able to basically pass or fail or predictably act no matter what 100% of the time. And the other huge advantage that we have of living inside of the browser is we have access to every single object. Like if you just want to tap into your window object, you can. And that gives us the ability to do all sorts of amazing things. We can begin to control the environment precisely. So I mean, you can still use Cypress to not touch anything, not modify any host objects. But you can also use Cypress to just mock out XHR requests. Like if you want to simulate things like delay from your server, maybe your page remotely grabs data on load and shows like a loading spinner until those things. You can use Cypress to test every variance of that state, of a long request, of a short request, of a request that sends back a server 500. And you don't need to actually force the world. You don't need to force your server. I'm sorry. Let me back up. You do not need to seed your database or create the conditions that cause your server to do that. You can just simply tell it to do that, and it will automatically intercept those requests and basically create that results. But what we do in doing that is we're basically no longer doing end-to-end testing. We're actually basically sliding down the ruler, down the pyramid, away from end-to-end tests and closer to like integration and unit tests. And it's really just up to the developer who's in the best position to be able to make those decisions. Like, when you're testing logging in, you probably don't want to mock anything. You probably really do need 100% confidence that everything works through every single layer. But then when you're working on other features, like if you want to test pagination or something like that, it's sort of ludicrous to think like, oh, and I have to like seed hundreds of records in a database in order for my server to send the results I want. I mean, that's insane. Just mock it. Force the request to have the payload that you want, and then test the side effects that way. So that's sort of the long story of why end-to-end testing is hard, and some of the things that Cypress does to solve that.
What a lot of times when we talk about end-to-end testing, it's this idea that it's going to sort of prevent issues that sort of pop up in what users would expect, because we test in a sort of full stack, right? We test in that browser so that we can see the interaction that occurs when things happen. But end-to-end testing isn't perfect, right? At the end of the day, if I implement a delay from my server for an API, for instance, that's not going to give me the user behavior, right? I'm really just testing to see what my application does and whether that test fails or passes, as opposed to my user saying, well, at 3 seconds, I'm bailing on your application, right? It doesn't tell necessarily the entire user story, correct?
I mean, that is true. I mean, it sounds like that would be more like a UX test, which I'm not sure any robot could necessarily perform. I don't know. There are a lot of different ways, a lot of different approaches. I mean, that is why some companies have QA engineers to do more like acceptance testing, which is that, okay, yes, these two robots talk to each other correctly, but does it really solve the problem that we're trying to solve with our site? And I don't think any automation framework is going to be able to do that. There is still a need for the human touch.
Sure, and I think that's where a lot of developers. I think there's a gap in sort of knowledge when it comes to end-to-end testing or even unit testing about what the purpose of that thing actually is. Where you say, hey, I want to test this small portion to make sure that my return meets my test. Where things are actually happening, and for developers, that's nice because we understand that. We understand that the end result of that target is this output. But that doesn't necessarily conceive of what our users experience, right? As an overall whole, where we want, if there's a bug that pops up, yet none of my tests are failing, right? Is that a bug, right? So we have to triage that accordingly. So I think a lot of times developers, as developers, and I'm as guilty as this as anybody, is that my tests are not failing, so it's all good. But at the end of the day, we have to ship for users, which means we sort of have to mishmash these things together. And I think for a lot of people, end-to-end helps that as well, right? You use bits and pieces, whether that's acceptance testing or QA, to sort of bring together a really sort of cohesive approach to developing and shipping really nice software.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest deliverable of an end-to-end test or an integration test is just, so much more coverage than, say, what a unit can give you. I don't know if you've ever seen like that YouTube video that went viral a while ago, and it was like 2 doors that someone installed. It was like both of them can like function, right? You can like twist their handle, open and close them, but the moment that you try to do them at the same time, like as soon as you try to actually open one door, it hits the other door, and therefore its basic function, falls apart. So it's like the caption is like 2 unit tests, no integration tests. So I don't know, yeah.
It's a great video.
Yeah, great video. So I would just say, why you would even want to do end-to-end testing is you get massive amounts of coverage in the perspective of a user. If your end-to-end test or your integration test pass, I mean, you can be pretty confident that overall, your service is working as expected.
That's great. So I actually have it allows you to do more intelligent testing, right? So you can kind of hybridize your integration and end-to-end tests. So you can kind of mock things when you need to, not mock things when you don't want to, and it lets you do that in one, with one tool, right? Essentially writing the same set of tests, perhaps even in the same describe block. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could simply have the feature as an end-to-end, and then within that, and then mock it a bunch of different ways so that you can control the environment and you can control the situation, and basically cover both halves. You have confidence that it is working completely, like really pulling the results from the server to get back your JSON or what have you, versus simulating it in order to test all of the different edge cases. Definitely.
Yeah, no, that sounds really powerful. And so I have a question just a little bit lower level, just about, so how developers can, so Gilad talked about, being able to easily get it into your projects, but what's the learning curve, right? So with the API, as well as, how can people leverage existing tests, right, written in Mocha or Jasmine, to use Cypress?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is a challenging answer. I would say that if you have an existing test suite in Selenium, I mean, it's fairly easy to port those over, but you're not going to get anything for free. I mean, there is definitely a learning curve. Hopefully, we're onboarding you and slowly revealing it to you, or we even have some plans to like try to gamify it and sort of make testing a lot more fun and interactive, and something that sort of you can just have like a boot camp to get through to have to achieve these things. But it's not going to be free. I mean, we're built on top of Mocha, so all that existing Mocha knowledge is going to transfer directly over. Like how you organize and split up your tests is going to transfer over. We're built on top of Chai, so assertions will, for the most part, feel about the same. We're built on top of sign-on, so doing your mocking and stubbing and using those libraries will feel about the same. But I mean, there's definitely a learning curve, and I don't think we've done like any studies per se. We sort of have ad hoc data to suggest sort of like where the drop-off point for developers. And I don't know, it's just something that we're going to have to work on and improve.
Cool. Yeah, that's always a tough thing because you guys are in you're in like a closed beta or something like that right now, right?
Yeah, yes, and I guess I kind of want to talk a little bit about this. I mean, Cypress is constantly evolving and changing, and we right now we serve to get Cypress. You download a desktop application that is built for your operating system, right? And right away that kind of feels a little unfamiliar. It's kind of like, wait a second, I download an app, but what don't I just check this into like my dev dependencies or something? Because that's like what I do with other tools. And so we're basically packaging it because that achieves what we need to sort of prove out right now. There's zero dependencies. It will run everywhere on everyone's machines, no matter what. And you basically have to do very little. But of course, especially when we go full blown open, it's publicly accessible. The entire desktop app is going to be open source. In fact, many components are already open source, but you're also going to be able to just check it in as a dev dependency. That is definitely something that we're going to be doing. It's just that you have to keep in mind that not everyone has a Node project, and in fact, only about a third of our users right now use Node primarily as their backend. So we sort of had to experiment with, well, how then? Okay, if we can't just expect a Node ecosystem to adopt this, then we've got to try out other things. And packaging as a desktop application was sort of like the 0-day solution, but it's not going to be how it's going to change. You're going to be able to check it in like everything else.
I mean, and I imagine that's one of the things that you guys are constantly, the types of feedback you guys are constantly looking into now as well, from people like Gleb and other folks and companies that you have working with that stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a Gitter channel. People can come in. We work really closely with our early adopters. We have several companies where their whole front-end team uses Cypress, and so we're regularly pairing with them and screen sharing and looking at their solutions. I mean, Cypress now has been in development for 2 years, and in that time, I mean, it's been used on hundreds of projects, and so it constantly evolves and sort of reshapes itself to best fit the environments that it's essentially attempting to solve. So it's not like something that just got developed in a vacuum that was only really built to solve my limited perspective of building web apps. It has been shifted and reshaped incrementally, little by little, to match what the general market needs.
Brian, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
How large is Cypress team? And what's the roadmap or timetable for general release?
Yep, so we actually just hired our 5th full-time person on Monday, so the team size is 5. We will absolutely, without a doubt, have a public release in 2016. There's no question about it. There are just very core specific things that are missing that when we go live, we have to have in place. I mean, our bigger goals are really to become an entire ecosystem. Other tools have come close. If you look at Karma, you have, a lot of plugins, a lot of ecosystem around that. You can look at Gulp, you can look at Grunt, you can look at, different frameworks and whatnot. And that is our goal as well. We want Cypress to be extensible. We want it to be extremely well documented with screencasts, with animated GIFs, basically walking you through this whole thing. And we want it to be completely open source. I mean, ultimately, we're trying to be champions for the open source community and web developers at large. We want you to use it on open source. We want you to use it at work. And to do that, we really have to sort of meet the needs and expectations that this community has sort of come to adopt when it's trying to gain critical mass and adoption.
Great. So we've mentioned a few things that Cypress does for you. Talked a little bit about helping you stub out your API calls and things like that. Can we talk a little bit about, or just kind of some bullet points of what some of the main features that Cypress gives you straight out of the box?
Sure. I think Gleb sort of talked on a few of them, but I'll sort of just highlight on some of the biggest ones. Like the moment that you open up a Cypress project and start testing, you'll immediately notice that as you use our API and as you issue commands like a real user, like DOM traversal, find this element, interact with this, walk up, walk down, click, double click, type, all those things. Every command that you issue is actually, we call it like a command log. So we have, our own runner. So when I say runner, I mean like if you were to use Mocha in a browser, right? You get like you're inside of a browser. You see the tests appear with a check mark and a hex and a total tally, and you see them complete and whatnot. So we have our own runner view, and that's what we call the web app. Like Cypress, even though it's a desktop app, that's where you launch your projects. But once you're inside of a project, you're just inside of a web application. And we're going to list off all of your tests. We're going to tell you about the configuration of Cypress. And then as you run tests, like they're going to show up on the left side. And you can expand the test to basically see a history of every single command that was run. And we automatically organize it, things like, obviously with Mocha, you have before each, after each hooks. Like we'll automatically organize the commands that ran based on the life cycle of the test. And every single command provides you this incredible amount of value to basically see what happened in a test. Because, arguably, we sort of touched on this point earlier, why is end-to-end testing so hard? Well, I mean, for a lot of different reasons. With the first primarily being when something fails, you have no idea what the hell the preceding conditions were that actually led up to the point of failure. I mean, it's basically like a black box, and with Phantom.js and other things like that, you can't even see what actually happened, which is just sort of ludicrous. So one of the things with Cypress is that as you issue commands that generally mutate the state of your application, you can hover on these and basically walk back in time to look at what the DOM snapshot was. And certain commands that have mutating abilities, like a click, well, we realized, when you're clicking something, you really need two states. You need like as the click was happening state, and then the post-click state. And other commands even have 3 states. And so as you're hovering over a command, it will automatically shift before and after. It'll shift through all the different states that we captured as that command was being executed. And of course, like just clicking on a command as their log provides you like all of the output of sort of what happened, like how many elements we found, whether we found an element. And all that information is shaped particularly to the different types of commands. So, if you're doing things like XHR, mocking, we will display to you sort of like a routing table that tells you like you've told when requests go out that meet these specifications to automatically like route them to specific responses. We'll display all that for you. And I mean, you can kind of go crazy here. Like we've sort of experimented with a lot of different ways to visually show you this, but the whole difference is that you have like just visual data that you can immediately look at and understand what the conditions were that led up to something. And it's going to feel really natural to you as a web developer. So I mean, really, that's just like one feature, I would say. But obviously, it's very different. Like no other tool offers that. Some other things, I mean, I'd basically just say there's no flake, and there's basically no waiting in Cypress. Waiting is a side effect of basically not really knowing what's going on. And anytime that you couple your test to a specific wait, you are introducing inherent flake. And instead of ever having to wait, you basically just describe the state of your application. Like what is the final state that I desire this application to be in order for this to pass? And Cypress will basically just automatically, intelligently retry, and it will understand what you're ultimately trying to do, and it will potentially alter its behavior in the moment that your application actually reaches that state. It knows to pass and move on. So I would say there's a lot of, I mean, it has been incredibly difficult to write this API. This is the hardest API I've certainly ever written, but for users using it, it's really simple to do.
Can I add something to Brian's points?
Of course.
So, Brian, yes, definitely. You don't have to write timeouts or wait, browser wait kind of 5 seconds when you're type, use Cypress, and we have so many browser wait commands in Selenium tests, it's not even funny. And it's not even funny when we have a variable that says like short delay, and it used to be 1 second, when it became 5 seconds, and now it's like 10 seconds. But going back to your first point, your runner is just amazing. And your application, your little proxy, when it runs, it creates a proxy server, and then you can open multiple browsers and execute your test in all different browsers on your local machine. You can even open like mobile browsers on your tablet and point at URL. And every time you change a test, all the browsers will run it again. So you literally have unbelievable cluster, and you can debug cross-platform like locally very easily. And Brian described that every action is there in a runner, and it's amazing when, for example, there is like type text, and if you hover or you click on that command in a runner, the browser will actually show you what the highlighted DOM elements, because it takes snapshots before, during, after states, and you can literally debug at that particular moment what the state of a DOM was, what the state of a data was. And to me, this is a huge, because to me, the value of a test, end-to-end test, is not when it passes like 5,000 times in a row. The value of a good test is when it fails, can I debug it quickly? And every time I use a Selenium test and it failed, I had to go into the code, I had to put like browser.debug or something. I had to open a browser, I had to go to some specific URL I could never remember. And then I could start debugging and actually looking around what actually failed. But if I let browser go on, I could never come back and inspect what actually the previous step value was, because I was too late. And so ability to inspect the DOM and the data for each action before and after is just incredible experience.
Yeah, to Gleb's point, I actually forgot about this, but when you issue actions like a user, like click or type or whatever, we will also show you a hitbox on the DOM. Not only will we highlight the element that sort of, which, when you're querying, query for this button will highlight, one or multiple elements that we found. When you issue actions, we'll actually display a little red dot, which is the hitbox of exactly the coordinates where that action took place. And furthermore, when you click on commands, things like type, for instance, we because Cypress lives in the same run loop, it knows what happened to the event propagation, and therefore we can display things like whether your event was prevented default, or whether its default action was canceled, or in the situation of type, even what car code and what events fired, did the input event fire, things like that. So basically, it is like, it's almost very complementary to DevTools itself, and it sort of reaches in and is able to tell you about sort of the core details of an event and bubble those out to help you understand what may or may not have happened.
That's really, really powerful. I'm now excited to see this UI. I have a really quick question about how web components and web component testing and how kind of Cypress wraps around that with encapsulation or shadow DOM, etc. Any support for that?
That is, I do not know. I will admit, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that we would have any problems with this. I mean, we have problems with iframes right now, although that's going to be solved, and I have some experimentation some experiments in the works to basically show that. I mean, the way that Cypress works is technically substantially more. It's so much harder to get right than the way that Selenium works, but the payoff is huge. And I imagine with web components, as long as they're accessible from window or document, we'll be able to handle them. But I don't actually have any use cases or experiments to show how that will or will not work. My guess is that if Selenium works with them, then we will work with them. And as long as it's part of the browser's native.
Uh-oh.
I think Brian, did we lose you?
I think we may have. That's fine. We truck on. I'm sure he'll be back.
I drop again. Sorry. There
Oh,
was like
yeah.
a
Oh,
long
there,
pause.
you're back.
Oh
Yeah,
That's
no.
just
fine.
just back up a few minutes.
Okay.
Not
So
a few minutes, like a minute.
okay. Well, the question was about.
Just start the whole podcast over.
Okay. Sorry. So the question was about web components and basically how we will handle that. And I actually don't know. I don't have any use cases or experiments or any users that have ever raised a flag. And maybe that's because maybe it naturally works. But basically, I was just saying that if Selenium can do it, then I mean, then by rote automatically we will be able to do it. It just may require some massaging. And I gave an example of that right now sub-nested iframe support is not built into Cypress, but we will be able to solve that as well. It's just that some things that come down the pipe we might have to, specifically support because the way that Cypress works is very different than Selenium, and it is much, 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 much harder to actually execute everything. But as long as the Shadow DOM is accessible from window or document, it should work just fine.
I just have to say that it makes me sad that nested iframes of any type still exist in certain scenarios. I understand why they exist there, but at the same time, sorry, that's just a diversion. You said nested iframes, and I shivered inside.
Yeah. So through sort of I guess my own personal journey of Cypress, I've had to go way, way, way back in time and reading specs from the 90s about basically how browsers actually work, and I've discovered all sorts of crazy things that I never knew existed, but basically that there is a spec and documentation for. And actually, iframes, although they were abused for a long time, are an incredible thing for browsers to be able to do. Just so it is so difficult to implement an iframe from the host's perspective. And I'll just say that I mean, yeah, there's still plenty of use cases. I mean, just think of when you want to add billing to your site. Unless you want to deal with PCI compliance, one of the best ways to do it is just to basically embed an iframe that comes from Braintree or whatnot. So the use case is absolutely legitimate, and it's been fun basically figuring out ways to support it.
And building test frameworks as a general rule of thumb can be, as you've just pointed out, really, really difficult. How long have you guys been working on Cypress?
I have been working full time on Cypress for almost 2 years now. And before Cypress, before I even realized that it was going to become Cypress, I had experimented with sort of the technology around it before that for probably at least a year. The moment that I sort of created Cypress or realized I wanted to do this full time was actually I was sitting at a talk at JSConf, and I don't know, it just suddenly hit me that I realized I was thinking sort of like about how we were doing certain things at the job that I was at, and I realized I could actually build this into an entire service that could work for everyone, that could work for no matter what you were doing. And then when I had that, I spent the first 6 months just technically proving it out, like running experiments to see if it was possible. And then it's just sort of like the adjacent possible, when you sort of realize one thing is, and you just make incremental improvements after, a couple of years of development, now you're sort of a whole galaxy further ahead than really anything that's happened previously. But it's all just small incremental stuff. I'll also just kind of say that we as a team we're based here in Atlanta, Georgia, and I realized that to do this well and to really solve testing required like the whole service and the platform side of it, where you have to like really spin up browser instances and whatnot, and basically like to Gleb's point earlier, he's basically talking about how when something fails, like you need the tools, you need the data available in order to figure out why something failed. And although we've like put together a really incredible, innovative local testing experience, that only really still solves the single developer working on a project. And we have yet to truly solve what it takes to run tests over a team in CI. And like right now, we're still just using basic Mocha reporters in CI to where when something fails, you basically get a stack trace. And albeit you get a really damn good stack trace, and there's a lot of information in that error message that's way better than anything else. But really what you need is you need the ability to have those snapshots or those screenshots, and you need the ability for all those commands to basically be rebuilt as a tree to where when you can go and review when something failed, it basically feels exactly the same as local. And when you want to iterate on that failure, instead of you iterating on it locally, you can actually iterate it in CI on the machine that it's running at. And to do that requires a whole host of things. So I guess making my point is that I realized this last year, and I realized I'm going to need a pretty substantial team to do this. So we raised venture capital money here in Atlanta, Georgia, at the end of last year, and so now this team is 5. We're likely going to grow more. We're likely going to raise a Series A. The question is just basically how much in order to build out this service.
Sounds like you need Redux.
Yeah, the Cypress code base is kind of insane. It is, it's huge. And yes, Redux or even RxJS has been on our radar to update the driver to redo it. It basically just uses promises top to bottom, but there's a lot of massive amounts of managing state. It's pretty crazy. To your point about how do you write a testing framework how do you test a testing framework? It's really difficult. It's actually interesting if you look at like Mocha specs, how it tests itself. It sort of assumes it to already sort of exist and be there. But like if you break something in Mocha core, it kind of breaks all of its own tests because it's no longer able to do the thing that it does. But we actually dog food Cypress on our own Cypress projects to where many of our UIs that we use in Cypress are actually tested with Cypress itself. And then all of our like back-end services and stuff, it's all Node. It's JavaScript top to bottom, and so we don't use Cypress for that. Obviously, we just use Mocha and all the typical tools we've already talked about.
I think we've got a couple more questions for you.
Yeah, I jumped on late. Sorry, guys. I have just one question about this. I don't want to embarrass myself since I don't know what was said or whatever. So I'll just come in and say, you said you wanted to scale and move out, and it's software as a service, and you do have it on GitHub. So that's awesome that we can actually build it on our own servers. I'm assuming, right? But what is the plan for scale? To have as far as like what is going to be able to be available on GitHub? For free.
Great question. I mean, this is so core to our model. I mean, for us, for Cypress to really work, it has to work for the community. It has to be right in line with everything else that we've come to love and adopt. I guess I'll just say that right now the core desktop product has not been open sourced, and there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of complexity around that. But when it is actually released publicly, the whole code base, top to bottom, for the desktop component is going to be open source. So, and it will always be and forever be free to use locally. Like it's software that you install on your machine. It's resources that you're using. Like we just want to be that experience for that, right? Like obviously you can fork it, you can make whatever modifications to it that you want, and we want to create like an ecosystem that makes it highly extensible for people to write plugins and stuff. However, when you are running in CI, there is no way of getting around it. You have to spin up real browsers in the cloud or otherwise and manage this and automatically like parallelize like the tests across those. And there is a massive amount of data that you have to aggregate, that you have to parse, that you have to analyze, that you have to capture, and then you have to make available back. That part is going to be where our service comes in, and trust me, you do not want to try to do this by yourself. It is incredibly difficult, and it is not cheap in order to build. That's the part that we're going to be charging for. to run private projects, right? But of course, all the open source stuff, we're going to run those for free. And then also, I mean, sort of the follow-up answer to this is that if you look at like Sauce Labs and Browser Stack, and we get this question a lot, which is like, what is your plan for cross-browser testing? Because that is a very, very important one. And when you think about this, like, I've talked to Sauce Labs a lot. I've talked to Browser Stack. I've used both of them. I mean, they have big engineering teams, which are mostly operations. It is no joke to be able to spin up like 700 or 800 different combinations of browsers. I don't know if you've ever looked at like the licensing for OS X. It is totally crazy. There's a reason why you can't spin up OS X machines, in Google Compute Engine or AWS and whatnot. And we do not want to do that. If I said like, oh, the whole thing's on hold until we like replicate all this infrastructure, it would take forever. So what we're going to do is you're just going to be able to give us your API key into them, and we will automatically be able to run across their grid. So that means that a big part of Cypress, and one of the reasons that it hasn't been open source yet, is we're basically backporting in Selenium functionality and capabilities, although I think we're going to do it much, much, much better than how other providers have done that. I mean, like, we actually understand how the drivers work and how like Selenium standalone is different than the way that the drivers work, and et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to be able to give that to us, and then we're still going to like manage the builds, and we're going to automatically pull out those assets, and we're going to automatically serve them back to you. So we're still going to create a seamless experience around that. One of the awesomest features that we've been working on, which is going to be totally insane and crazy, but it works, is right from within Cypress itself, you're going to be able to spawn cross-browser instances right from within Chrome, but actually use Cypress from Chrome, and it's automatically remotely synchronized with the other instance. So like that's another pain point of testing, is that like when something does fail in a cross-browser, you've got to go out and sort of spin it up and maybe manually play around with it, and it just doesn't match like that same experience that you have like when you're initially writing your tests. And with this, what basically happens is that you still get all the reporter, all the feedback inside of Chrome, even stack traces that are automatically rewritten to where you can like inspect them with the Chrome dev tools. But yet it's going to be driving, IE11 that's in the cloud somewhere, potentially spun out by Sauce Labs or Browser Stack. And so it's basically like we're just integrating and sort of using the resources that are available to us into like a full comprehensive, testing suite that really works.
Sounds like you guys are doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, so you need a team of developers to do that. So that is the logic of sort of the progression of what we've done.
But if you were masochistic, right, you could put it all on your own servers and try that, if you so desired to be in pain forever.
I mean, yes, you can run your own
support people and all that.
I mean, you can run Selenium Grid yourself, but there's sort of a reason why we use software as a service, because it is generally much more expensive to redesign and redevelop and manage all of that than it is to just use a provider. But of course, you're free and it's open source, so go ahead. Actually, realistically, we'll probably offer like an on-premise image or something like that. That's sort of the new way of handling that. I'm sure there's going to be users, big corporations with ridiculous requirements and restrictions on their code, and I'm sure that's something that we will handle.
So I'm going to try to squeeze in the last question, by the way, and it's been such a pleasure learning about this awesome framework that clearly solves a lot of problems in an intuitive way. So this may be a combination for Gleb and yourself. I'm really interested to know how fast it is to run these tests. We've talked about it's easy to run, right? It's easy to write, easy to run. Comes with all these features, but is it fast? And also, are these synchronous or asynchronous? Can we run tests, concurrently? I don't even know is that the right word?
Yeah, absolutely.
I speak 4 languages. It's a little hard sometimes. So.
Sure. Well, yeah, running like Ava, the new test runner that's sort of like competitor Mocha, we're now
Yeah,
sort of, yeah. So running in a browser is just different. It is impossible to do that inside of a browser. I mean, well, it's not impossible, but basically, there's only one document, and it would basically be impossible to run tests concurrently. With that said, however, that's one of the things, like, that's part of our service, right? Like, when you're running it in CI, we're automatically going to, instead of spinning up one browser, we're going to spin up like 10 browsers, and we are going to automatically manage, splitting up your tests across them. But it's still done by file. There's like no getting around. You cannot, once you've built the tree of specs, be able to like shift some of these off to something else, and especially not when you're running it locally. You literally need n number of browser instances. But when it comes to speed, just generally locally, I mean, it is basically as fast as the browser can physically render. The bottleneck is not Cypress. It is basically the browser's capability. It doesn't like respawn instances between tests. It basically like intelligently blows away the state of the previous one. Like there's like a reset lifecycle. It automatically watches your test files using all the standard file watching libs. It uses Chakadar under the hood, so file changes get picked up within like 100 milliseconds, and it's basically going to instantly blow away everything that's happening and rerun the test. Ideally, your tests reload and complete sub-second. I've seen a lot of users of Cypress, and not everyone is like doing that. There's still like plenty of like anti-patterns that you can do that cause long feedback loops of like 45 seconds or something before you get to a pass or fail. But it is there to be able to get sub-second responses. And like when we're writing our own tests internally, that's pretty much how the feedback loop feels. So really for the first time, what this does is like instead of like writing your code in development environment and having Chrome open and refreshing, or if you're using the latest tools, sometimes you can even not have to refresh and rebuild your state. But really what Cypress wants to do is it wants to replace dev. It wants you to just test and dev all at the same time. And as long as there's not like a context switch, as long as you still have access to all your same dev tools, you can all your the capabilities of the debugger, then you can really do both at the same time. You can TDD or even sort of like experiment. You could like drive the browser to do a couple of things that you want to automate, and then go hack on your feature. And then when you're done with that, instantly like finish your test. So you're sort of getting this incremental test dev, test dev, test dev. And that is 100% possible with what Cypress does right now.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time for this episode. Brian Gleb, thank you so much for being on the show. Where on the internets and the intertubes can the wonderful people find you?
Oh, I mean, they can just go to Cypress.io, fill out an early adopter form, get on our mailing list. Preferably, though, they can just join our Gitter channel, gitter.im/Cypress.io. They can also find the information on our repos and whatnot. And just come in and chat, or use it and give us feedback, and we'd be happy to talk to you.
Thank you, Brian. People can find me at my personal website, glebbakhmutov.com, my first and last name together, or at Bakhmutov on Twitter. I got lucky to snatch my last name.
We will make sure to put all these links and information into the show notes, because generally I can't spell. So this always generally helps get things where they are.
Yeah, Gleb also has like a very serious blog for, and a bunch of slides that are awesome from all his, talks and whatnot. So it's a great resource.
Thank you. And at my blog, there's a blog post about Cypress, what kind of kicked it off, this conversation.
Awesome. So if you can actually put a link in our doc, and we'll make sure that gets out as well.
Will do.
Well, thanks for having me.
Wonderful host. Do you have any parting words as we close out this episode?
No, I just thank, again, same as everybody said, thank you both very much. It's been very informative. I actually just finished I'm working on filling out the Cypress.io early adopter form thing now, so so that hopefully I can play around with it. So, but yeah, just thank you for coming on.
Likewise, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Well, this has been another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. We hope to see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.